Four armed robbers walked into a bank in Argentina and took hostages. The police surrounded the place, and after several hours of negotiation, the robbers announced they would surrender on the condition that the police bring them pizza. The pizza arrived, but suddenly, the robbers cut all lines of communication with the police. The police decided to storm the bank, but inside, there was no one except the hostages. When they went down to the basement, they found the bank's vault looted, and there was no sign of the robbers or any indication of how they escaped. They didn't find a hole in the ground or any exit they could have used. The police immediately turned their attention to the hostages, suspecting that the robbers might be hiding among them. So, were the robbers really disguised among the hostages? And where did they actually go? That's what we'll find out in today's story. Hello everyone, Shams Al-Din here. In 2006, the largest bank robbery in Argentina was carried out. A clever and incredibly complex heist. The robbers who carried out this operation were four. The first was the leader, named Fernando Arau. The second was the mastermind, named Sebastian Bolster. The third was named Beto de la Torre, and we'll call him the financier. And the fourth was named Luis Silance, and we'll call him the enforcer. There were also two people who helped them from the outside, whose identities remain unknown. The first was nicknamed the Doctor, and the second, the Kid. I want you to remember these four names, and I've given each a nickname to make it easier to recall them. The story begins with Fernando, the leader and mastermind of the heist. This man once went to a psychiatrist and told him, "I want to rob a bank." The doctor was surprised and thought Fernando was speaking under the influence of marijuana, as Fernando was always smoking and using it. The doctor asked him, "Okay, so where did you get this desire? Do you need money?" Fernando replied, "No, I don't need money. But you know me, I'm an artist, and I love art, and I feel like I can create a great work of art in the field of bank robberies." The doctor asked, "Okay, and how do you plan to pull off this heist?" Fernando replied, "I don't know yet, but this idea consumes my mind and my entire being. I think about it before bed, after I wake up, and every moment of my day. I want to rob a bank." At that moment, the doctor didn't take his words too seriously and assumed it was just the marijuana talking. But Fernando was genuinely planning to rob a bank, and he would go on to execute the smartest and biggest bank robbery in Argentina's history. During that period, Fernando would go out every day and roam the streets of Buenos Aires, the Argentine capital, scouting potential targets for the operation. Eventually, he found a bank called Banco Rio, one of the well-known banks located in a very wealthy area, essentially a bank where rich people stored their assets, money, and valuable belongings. After that, Fernando began thinking about how to carry out the heist. The first method was to enter the bank with their weapons while it was open, take the money from the tellers, and leave quickly before the police surrounded the place. But the problem with this method was that it was high risk, and the loot would be small since they wouldn't have enough time to reach the vault and loot its contents. They'd have to get out fast before the police arrived. The second method was to break into the bank when it was closed, and this method usually requires digging a tunnel underground to reach the vault. But the problem with this method is that it could be quickly discovered, as banks are equipped with thermal sensors and advanced alarm systems that can easily detect if someone enters the vault while it's closed. Both methods were risky and difficult. So Fernando thought that if he was going to take a risk anyway, he should at least go for the bigger loot, which meant he would opt for the second method. He was going to dig the tunnel and get into the vault while the bank was closed, so he started thinking about how he could dig it. At first, he thought about renting a ground-floor apartment or a nearby warehouse and digging a tunnel from there to the vault. But in the end, Fernando got a nice surprise that saved him all that work. One day, During his scouting trips, he noticed the manhole covers along the street in front of the bank. Every 10 meters or so, there was a manhole, which meant there was already a tunnel running underneath, the sewer tunnel. Fernando kept following these manholes down the street until he reached the sewer outlet. The outlet was a large opening only 150 meters from the bank, meaning he found a ready-made tunnel. Right away, Fernando entered the sewer and started exploring it. At first, the tunnel was square-shaped, but after walking about 100 meters, he reached a circular tunnel about 6 meters in diameter, a massive tunnel running under the city and right in front of the bank. Now, Fernando needed someone to help him. There was no way he could pull off this operation alone. The first person who came to mind was one of his friends, Sebastian Bolster, who we've nicknamed the Engineer, because the guy was an expert in electronics and mechanics. When Fernando went to Sebastian and explained the idea to him, Sebastian was shocked because, as far as he knew, Fernando had no criminal history or experience in theft or anything like that. All he knew about him was that Fernando loved art and weed. How could someone like that be planning to rob a bank? But Fernando explained the details and the idea he had in mind, how they could get to the vault through the underground sewer tunnel. At that point, Sebastian started seriously thinking about it. Even though he'd never stolen anything in his life and never thought about getting into that kind of thing, his family's past with banks had been tragic. All his family members had been hurt when the banking system collapsed at one point in Argentina, and they lost a lot of their savings and money, and they never got any of it back. So, Sebastian started seeing this as a sort of payback. The banks were the bad guys in his eyes, and if he stole from them, it wouldn't be anything immoral. At least from his point of view. Engineer Sebastian told Fernando the leader he was down for the job. Now, the two of them went together to the bank's location and the sewer underneath it, and they began doing the calculations to figure out exactly where they'd dig. The first thing Fernando did was bring measuring tapes and started lowering them into the manholes. These tapes would help them know exactly where they were when they were inside the tunnel and how far they were from the surface. After that, they went into the bank and secretly took a bunch of pictures, pretending to be new customers. They went down to the vault in the basement to check it out. They got an estimate of its size and the number of safety deposit boxes it held. There were hundreds of safety deposit boxes. But even with all these calculations, everything was still approximate, and they didn't have precise numbers. To get those exact numbers, they needed to get the bank's building plans, which were likely at City Hall. That's when they realized they needed help from people with experience in the world of heists. On top of that, they needed financial backing because the tools Sebastian was going to make would require money. At this point, Fernando started looking for a new partner to join them. He got in touch with someone we've nicknamed the Doctor. This person's identity was never revealed, and he played the role of coordinator only. He wasn't actually part of the operation. The Doctor told Fernando he would connect him with the right people to help them out. The first person was Beto della Torre, who we've called the financier. Beto had a criminal record and was a gangster. And even though he didn't have direct experience with heists, he did have experience with weapons. Fernando and the Doctor met up with Beto, and when Beto heard the details, he was excited to join them. Fernando asked him, "Do you have the ability to fund the operation? Because we're going to need a lot of tools." Beto answered him bluntly, "I don't have any money, but I've got a truck I can sell, and with that money, I can fund the operation." And that's how Beto became the third key member of the crew. The Doctor, as we said, was a mystery, and we didn't even count him as part of the crew since he was just a coordinator and didn't actually participate in the heist. The important thing was that Fernando, the leader, still needed a fourth person to help with the physical labor, since engineer Sebastian would be busy making the tools, and he also had some family issues going on. And Beto, the financier, was older and moved slowly, so he couldn't handle it all by himself. That's when the doctor suggested the fourth person who would join the crew. This guy was named Luis Silance, and we've called him the Enforcer. Luis was also a gangster with a criminal record, and he had a lot of experience in theft. He had carried out several operations and had been imprisoned for 15 years in one of the toughest prisons. Luis, the Enforcer, was a stubborn guy, and you always felt like he was ready to turn violent at any moment. But despite all that, he was smart and had a talent for acting and deception, playing an important role in the heist later on. Now, the gang was complete. Fernando the leader, Sebastian the engineer, Beto the financier, and Luis the Enforcer. The four of them started discussing the details of the heist, and they went down into the sewer tunnel together to check out the site and the calculations Fernando and Sebastian had made. The next step, like we said, was that they needed exact calculations, and to get those, they needed the building plans for the bank. Luis, the Enforcer, said to them, "I'll get you those plans." They asked him how, and he said, "Don't worry, I'll get them." And sure enough, a few days later, he brought the plans and laid them out in front of them. To this day, they don't know how he got them. Did he bribe a City Hall employee? Or did he break in and steal them himself? No one knows. The important thing was that he got them. After that, they were able to calculate the exact spot they needed to dig inside the sewer tunnel. They calculated the length of the tunnel and the angles it needed to be slanted at, and they drew up a detailed plan with all the measurements they'd need for the digging. Then they started gathering the tools they needed. They brought in a diesel-powered generator, some digging tools, and large drills, and they began digging on the side of the tunnel. There was always someone stationed above on the street to keep an eye on things and make sure the sound of the digging wasn't being heard outside the sewers. Of course, the digging was going to take several months at least. Now, they had to solve the next problem: the heat sensors and alarms that would go off as soon as they broke into the vault. Fernando the leader, being an artistic type, started coming up with an idea for a suit that would hide their body heat from the sensors. The suit was made from sleeping bags used by campers and mountain climbers. He bought a thermal camera and started testing it to see if it could detect body heat or not. But the idea of the suit was a bit scary. It still had a chance of failing, especially since they'd need to move around a lot inside the vault. And they'd have a lot of tools and equipment that the sensors could pick up. So, overall, the idea wasn't very safe and carried high risks. Fernando the leader was frustrated by this, and he kept trying to think of a safer way to get into the vault. Then suddenly, one day, he had a crazy idea. All along, he'd been focused on the idea of robbing the bank while it was closed and breaking into the vault from underground without anyone seeing them. He had dismissed the idea of storming the bank with weapons because the police would surround the place quickly. So, the new idea that popped into his head was to combine both methods, the tunnel digging and the armed robbery. The idea was that instead of using the tunnel to get in, they would use it to get out. This way, the sensors and alarms wouldn't matter. The police would surround the place from the outside, but they would have no clue the robbers were escaping underground. When this idea hit Fernando, he went wild and started searching the internet to see if anyone had ever pulled off something like this before, but he couldn't find any similar case. He thought he was the first person in the world to come up with this idea. But in reality, he hadn't heard about the 1995 bank robbery in Germany, pulled off by some Arabs. If you want me to talk about that heist in another video, let me know in the comments, and I'll do that. Anyway, since Fernando couldn't find anything about this method back then, that meant it hadn't reached the police in Argentina yet. and they probably wouldn't expect it. When Fernando told the group about the plan, they were all shocked and excited. Now, they had to add weapons and other equipment they'd need. Beto, the financier, said he'd handle the weapons part since he was a gangster and had experience in that area. But keep in mind, there's something special about the weapons they're going to use, which we won't reveal until the end of the story. So, keep that in mind and stay tuned until the end to find out the details. The whole thing took about a year in total. During that year, they finished digging the tunnel and built a small dam inside the sewer tunnel. The purpose of this dam was to raise the water level to a certain height because they planned to use small inflatable boats inside the tunnel. They knew that when they were escaping with the loot, they wouldn't be able to carry it while walking because part of their bodies would be submerged in the sewer water, which would slow them down a lot. So, using boats was necessary. They built the dam to raise the water level inside the tunnel, allowing the boats to move easily. Then they discussed the escape route. The initial idea was to escape toward the sewer's exit and get out that way. But then they realized that the police might focus their attention on the exit and block their way. So, they started studying the other direction, which was the opposite of the sewer exit, and they found it was much better because there were hundreds of exits, which were the manholes along the tunnel. These manholes were about every 10 meters. After studying the reverse route, they picked a specific manhole about 200 meters away from the bank to use as their exit. They then decided to bring in a van and park it right over the manhole. They would cut a hole in the van's floor directly above the manhole, allowing them to climb straight from the sewer into the van without anyone seeing them. Beto, the financier, brought a small van and parked it in his garage. The gang gathered in the garage to modify the van and cut a hole in its floor. Suddenly, Beto's wife walked in. The gang started asking Beto why his wife was there, and he assured them everything was fine. This was the only time they ever met Alicia Del Tullio, Beto's wife. Keep that in mind because she'll play an important role later in the story. Anyway, after the gang finished modifying the van, they now needed to get the weapons. This is where the second unknown person comes in, someone they called the Kid. This person, like the doctor, had an unknown identity and was responsible for driving the van and waiting for them inside until they finished the heist. Everything was now ready, and the only thing left was to figure out how to quickly open the safety deposit boxes inside the vault, as there were hundreds of boxes, and opening them manually would take way too long. Sebastian, the engineer, made a hydraulic tool they called the cannon. The purpose of this tool was to break open the locks on the safety deposit boxes in just 7 seconds per box. So, they'd be set for the job. Finally, after all this prep and effort, everything was ready, as you can see. This is the sewer tunnel they'll enter with the boats, and this is the tunnel they dug, leading to the bank above it. Here's the bank vault with all the safety deposit boxes located in the basement of the bank, about 200 meters away. This is the sewer exit they'll come out of, and above it is the van with the open floor they'll use to escape. The gang set the date for the heist, January 13th, 2006. Sebastian was the only engineer who entered through the sewer tunnel. At the tunnel's entrance, the small inflatable boats and tools were ready, with the cannon leading the charge. After that, Sebastian went through the dug tunnel until he reached the bank's wall, which was right behind the vault, and waited there until his crew gave him the signal. His teammates, Fernando, Beto the financier, and Luis the brute, were all standing outside the bank's door. Once they were sure everything was in place and everyone was in position, they stormed the bank with their guns raised, immediately taking the customers and employees inside as hostages, ordering them to lie on the floor. The bank guard, who was in the surveillance room, locked himself in and quickly alerted the police. It took just a few minutes before the nearby police patrols arrived at the bank. This is where Fernando put his pre-planned move, the cuckoo plan, into action. The idea was to take one of the hostages, walk out the bank's front door, and make it seem like he was trying to escape, but then quickly run back inside when he saw the police surrounding the building. The point of this move was to trick the police into thinking they were planning to flee before the cops showed up. They even parked a decoy car in front of the bank, making it seem like it was their getaway car. But since the police arrived so fast, the plan failed, and they were now trapped inside the bank. Still, the cuckoo plan worked, because when the operations commander arrived, the police told him the robbers had tried to flee out the front door, but went back inside quickly when they saw the police surrounding the place. So, the operations commander assumed the robbers were trapped and had no other way out. The robbers inside the bank had everything under control except for one thing: the guard, who had locked himself in the surveillance room. They had to get him out somehow because he was still in direct contact with the police, and if he saw them leaving the bank, he'd alert the cops immediately, which would ruin their plan. They kept trying to negotiate with the guard, with Luis the Brute telling him nothing would happen to him if he opened the door. But things would get worse if he didn't. The guard stood his ground, saying he wouldn't give himself up no matter what. At that point, Luis grabbed one of the bank employees, put a gun to her head, and started threatening the guard, saying he'd kill her if the guard didn't come out. The guard still refused, but the employee Luis was holding started crying, and that hit the guard hard because he worked with her and knew her. She began pleading with the guard through her tears, begging him to come out, saying she wanted to see her daughter again. The guard couldn't ignore her crying and begging anymore, so he finally said to Luis, "Okay, I'll come out. Just don't hurt her." He opened the door, put his gun on the table, and surrendered to the robbers. After that, Luis frisked him, took his phone, and said, "Walk in front of me." He escorted him to the bank's door and said, "Leave." The guard, confused, asked to make sure, "Just walk out the door?" Luis replied, "Yes, leave." So the guard walked out the door with his hands up and went over to the police and special forces surrounding the building. The operations commander asked him about the situation inside the bank, and the guard told him he saw 3 armed robbers and that they were holding about 30 hostages inside. He also mentioned they took his phone. Through the bank windows, the operations commander could see one of the masked robbers holding the phone and gesturing to them like he was saying, "Call the guard's phone." At the same time, Fernando contacted Sebastian, the engineer, who was waiting in the tunnel behind the vault wall. Fernando told him to start breaking through the wall. Sebastian began drilling from the outside and soon heard something moving on the other side. That sound was Fernando moving a filing cabinet that had been placed right over the spot Sebastian was drilling through. Once Sebastian's head appeared through the hole, Fernando sighed with relief because now they were sure their tunnel connected to the bank. Up until that moment, they were terrified they might have dug in the wrong place. Sebastian, the engineer, entered the vault with the hydraulic tool, the cannon, and started using it to break open the safety deposit boxes, of which there were an overwhelming number. The plan was to spend 2 hours opening as many boxes as possible, estimating they could break into about 400 boxes within that time. So, Sebastian the engineer and Fernando the leader stayed down in the vault, carrying out the heist, while upstairs, Luis the Brute and Pedro the financier were keeping control of the hostages and stalling the police until the 2 hours they had set for themselves were up. Luis the Brute was the one handling the phone, and like I told you, he had this strange talent for working the phone. He managed to stall the police so well and built such a reputation for himself that even the media covering the event started calling him the guy in the gray suit. Even the operations commander, when he called, was surprised at how calm and casual Luis was, like nothing serious was going on. The commander asked him, "What are your demands?" "What do you want?" Luis the brute answered, "Honestly, we came to rob the bank, and we planned to get out quick, but you guys trapped us faster than we expected. We don't want to hurt anyone, but now we're not sure what to do." The commander was watching Luis through his binoculars from one of the bank windows and saw him sitting in a chair, legs crossed, looking relaxed as if nothing was bothering him. The commander was shocked at how calm this guy was. That's when he realized this man in front of him had experience and had done this before. Luis continued, "What's up, my friend? I just got out of Sago prison after doing 15 years, and this isn't my first heist. I know your procedures and your tricks, so don't try anything with me, because that could end badly for the hostages." The commander replied, "All right, don't worry. We won't do anything or play any tricks. Just release one of the hostages to show good faith." Luis fired back, "We already let the guard go. Why are you guys so greedy?" "Greed's not good. We'll decide when to let hostages go, all right? Bye." And he hung up. With that, Luis showed the commander that he was fully in control of the hostages, making the commander think twice before trying anything reckless. And that's exactly what the robbers needed. Time. One funny situation that happened was when Luis the brute and Pedro, the financier, who were with the hostages, found out that one of the hostages, an old lady, was having her birthday that day. So, they went to the small kitchen attached to the bank, grabbed a little cake, and started singing "Happy Birthday" to her. They even forced all the hostages lying on the floor to sing along. In the end, they told her they'd give her a birthday gift by letting her go. And they did. They let her walk out the door and leave. This story's been mentioned in a few sources, but it's so wild that even I can't believe it. Luis the brute kept talking with the operations commander, making up new stories or distractions each time. Once, he even told them, "Call my lawyer so you can negotiate our surrender terms with him." He gave them a phone number that actually belonged to one of the hostages with him, pretending it was his lawyer's number. When the police called the number that was supposed to be for the lawyer, Luis answered himself, changing his voice and pretending to be the lawyer, saying he was on his way to negotiate the terms of their surrender. This guy was something else. He managed to keep stalling the police with ease for the full 2 hours they needed to finish the job. When the 2 hours were up, unfortunately, Sebastian the engineer and Fernando the leader hadn't been able to open as many boxes as they'd hoped. They only managed to open 147 boxes. The hydraulic tool they had, the cannon, kept overheating, so it couldn't work as efficiently as they'd expected. But even so, the loot they got wasn't small. It was more than enough for them. They decided not to push their luck and stuck to the time they had set for themselves, not letting greed blind them. At that point, Fernando called Luis the brute and told him they were done and ready to start executing their escape plan. That's when Luis pulled out the last trick they had saved for the police. He called the operations commander and said, "Listen, we're ready to surrender, but we know we'll be locked up for a long time without enough food. So before we give ourselves up, we want pizza, enough for us and the hostages." The operations commander responded, "All right, we'll get you the pizza." Luis insisted that it be authentic Italian pizza from a specific restaurant that was really far from the bank to buy them as much time as possible. The commander agreed, saying, "Okay, we'll get it from that place." After that conversation, Luis cut off all communications and ordered the hostages to stay down, face to the ground, and not to move. He warned them that if anyone moved, they'd shoot immediately. Meanwhile, Fernando and Sebastian were in the vault, gathering all the loot into bags and throwing them through the tunnel they had dug. Luis and Pedro quickly joined them in the vault, and before they left, they laid down a small rug on the floor and placed their weapons on it. To this day, no one knows why they did that. After climbing through the hole in the wall, they pushed a filing cabinet back to cover the hole and placed something that looked like a bomb on it. Then, they quickly descended into the small inflatable boats waiting for them underground. They got into one boat, tied the other to it with a rope, and moved through the sewer tunnel until they reached the exit. They took the loot bags with them, climbed up a ladder, and at the top, a van with a driver was waiting for them. They loaded the bags through a hole in the van's floor, and the van was just barely big enough for them and all the bags. Then, they drove off without anyone seeing them. They headed to the safe house they had prepared in advance. When they arrived, they pulled the van into the garage and unloaded the loot. The first thing they did was turn on the TV to watch the news and see if the police had started going after them yet. The funny thing was, the police hadn't even raided the bank by then. The gang was watching TV, happy, like they were watching a movie, waiting for the reaction when the police finally discovered what they had done. After the pizza Luis requested arrived, the police tried to contact him multiple times, but all their attempts failed. That's when the operations commander decided it was time to storm the bank. So he ordered the Special Forces soldiers to move in, prepared for a shootout. But when they raided the bank, all they found were the hostages lying on the ground. Since the robbers had hidden the hole in the wall, the police couldn't figure out how they had escaped or where they went. At first, they assumed the robbers had somehow blended in with the hostages. So, when they escorted the hostages out of the bank, they treated them like detainees until they confirmed their identities. Finally, after some time searching the bank, the police discovered the hole hidden behind the filing cabinet. But the problem was that there was something in front of the hole that looked like a bomb. So, they had to call in the bomb squad to inspect it. In the end, they discovered it was a fake bomb. All of this was happening while the gang was chilling in the safe house, watching TV and celebrating the success of their heist. Right after, they divided the loot among themselves without even counting it properly. They just eyeballed it because actually counting it would have taken too long. The loot was a small mountain of cash, gold, and jewelry, and it was estimated to be worth about $19 million. This heist was classified as the largest bank robbery in Argentina's history. After dividing the loot, the plan was for each of them to go their separate ways and never see each other again. Everyone took their share, got in their cars, and drove off. Everyone was happy, but one person would soon be disappointed, and the others would follow one by one. That person was Pedro, the financier. When Pedro got home, his kids and wife Alicia were waiting for him eagerly. Alicia knew about the heist, so she was excited, waiting for the fortune that would change their lives forever. Pedro threw a big celebration that night with his wife and kids. Time passed, and one day, when Pedro came home after hanging out with some friends, he noticed one of the loot bags he had hidden in a closet had been moved. When he opened the bag, he discovered a large amount of money was missing. He went to his wife Alicia and asked, "Tell me, did you take some of the money?" She calmly replied, "Yeah, I took 5 or 6 small bags." Imagine, 5 small bags that contained about $300,000. Pedro yelled in anger, "We're trying to keep a low profile, and you take that much money without telling me? Are you trying to get us caught?" That's when a huge fight broke out between them. Pedro demanded she return the money she took, but she refused. The argument escalated, and in the end, Pedro decided to take the rest of his loot and the remaining bags from the house and hide them somewhere else. but he never expected his wife would hold such a grudge against him. As soon as he left the house, Alicia went straight to the police and turned him in. She probably thought he was cheating on her, planning to run away with a secret lover, and that he took the money to live with her and leave his family behind. Imagine. Jealousy caused all of this, even though Pedro didn't have a lover at all. On the contrary, he loved his family, and it was impossible for him to go anywhere without them. There are a lot of details about what happened next, but we won't go into them because they're not that important. In short, Pedro was arrested, and after his arrest, they interrogated him, but he refused to reveal the identities of his partners. However, thanks to his wife's help and some other evidence, like tracking their phones, which we won't get into too deeply, they were eventually able to identify the 4 people involved in the heist, and warrants were issued for all of them. Even though each of them went in different directions, they all got caught in the end. Imagine, Fernando, the leader, was hiding in a tent in the middle of nowhere. But the National Guard patrols managed to catch him. Luis, the violent one, fled all the way from Argentina to Uruguay, but even there, he was arrested. Sebastian, the engineer, was the easiest to catch. They arrested him while he was just sitting in his house. All 4 of them were arrested and put on trial. The crazy thing is that most of the loot was never recovered because the robbers hid it in hard-to-find places and refused to reveal where it was. In the end, they were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 9 to 15 years, but none of them served their full time. Instead, they were all released early for good behavior. Fernando and Sebastian only spent about 2 years in prison, and after that, they were placed under house arrest for 2 years. As for Pedro and Luis, because they had prior records, they stayed in prison a bit longer. Luis for about 6 years, and Pedro for 8 years, which is still way less than the original sentence they were given, which was already pretty light. So now the question is, in a case of an armed robbery involving millions, is this really the right punishment? How could the sentences be so lenient? The main reason was the weapons they used. Remember when I told you there was something special about their weapons? And remember when I said they laid their weapons out on a rug as they left the bank? The reason is that their weapons were fake. They weren't real. Imagine, they pulled off a huge operation like this, took hostages, and messed with the police and special forces with fake weapons. Of course, the reason for this was that if they got caught, the sentence for armed robbery is way different than for unarmed robbery. This is what led to the light sentences and early releases. But the strange thing is that most of the loot was never recovered. No one knows. Maybe there was a secret deal with the authorities to return a large part of the money in exchange for early release, because letting them go for nothing seems really strange. The only other possibility is that bribes were involved, but these are all just guesses. Only God knows what happened behind the scenes. The bank's customers were, of course, compensated by the bank and insurance companies. A drama movie was made about the case, and there's also a documentary. In the documentary, the 4 of them actually appear and brag about the heist, like it's no big deal. It seems like they're still living comfortable lives. I'm not exactly sure what happened to the money, but that's the end of our story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. And here are some cool clips you can check out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.